That was only one contentious topic. Now we have two speakers that in many ways are very hard security issues at one level, and at another level, they dominate our popular imagination. The issue of Israel and Palestine and Iran today are some of the hottest and most contentious issues in the global discourse. But within that, there is the existence of the Mossad. And in most people's mind, the Mossad is something akin to a James Bond character. It is filled with mystique, with a sense of dread, with a sense that that is a domain that none of us really understand. To understand Israel and its relations with the world through the workings of the Mossad, we have today somebody very, very extraordinary, Efraim Halevy, who has been the chief of the Mossad under 3 Israeli prime ministers, and who has extremely radical views about how one should engage with one's enemies, not through assassinations, not through military might, but through talking and understanding the mind of the enemy. And with him, we have Kanwal Sibal, former foreign secretary, a very experienced diplomat who's been the ambassador in Paris, Cairo, and Ankara, has seen India through some of the most cataclysmic foreign events, geopolitical events, 9/11, the bombing of the parliament, and many other situations. And speaking to them is Nidhi Razdan, the senior editor of NDTV and anchor of the very popular show Left, Right, and Center. Please welcome all of them.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session titled War Talks and Peace Moves. Shoma has introduced our two guests with us on stage today, and it's fascinating to be able to talk to an ex-spy, especially someone who's been head of the Mossad. And Mr. Halevy, what I find particularly interesting about you, and I want to begin with Iran, because that's a contemporary issue in world politics right now, is that you actually believe that there should be a dialogue with Iran. And you've been quoted as saying that we need to understand how the Iranians think and what makes them tick. Explain that to us.
Well, I believe that dialogue is probably the most important aspect of human relations, relations between states and societies, and also between enemies. And I believe that basically and fundamentally, in order to be able to reach a point where you can come to your enemy, or your enemy can come to you, and find common ground, is only by dialoguing. I don't think that conflict is the ultimate purpose of life. I think the ultimate purpose of life is to try and reach accommodation with as many people and as many peoples around the world as you can. And in this spirit, I believe that if we can reach a dialogue with Iran and Iranians, I think that we will be making a major step forward in trying to resolve one of the most intractable problems that we have today.
I would say that you're probably one of the rarest voices to come out of Israel to say that, and you have been head of Mossad, serving under 3 prime ministers. You've been national security advisor. Did you have these views when you were in office, or is it something that evolved over time?
I've had these views all the time. I was extremely active in the Mossad for many years, in looking for what I call chinks in the wall, trying to find those very, very sometimes elusive possibilities of creating peace between us and our enemies. It was the Mossad which actually engineered and also promoted the first peace treaty we ever had with Egypt in the 70s. I myself was very active in promoting the peace treaty which we signed with Jordan. We have also been active in many other ways in promoting a whole long list of contacts and relations which we have had over many, many years with countries with which we did not enjoy diplomatic relations. Without going into too many details, I will say that even with this country, we were active in certain times and certain periods in having those contacts with India, which ultimately led to the establishment of relations, diplomatic relations as they are today, between India and Israel. And therefore, the Mossad is not just an organization which deals with threats and with enemies. It's also a major element in the Israeli government which deals with finding ways and means of creating options for peace between us and all possible countries and nations around the world.
I want to ask you about some of your personal journeys and anecdotes and what really led you to this point of view. But I wanted to ask Mr. Sibal, on Iran in particular, do you feel that the Israeli version of the threat from Iran is exaggerated? Exaggerated.
Well, you know, it's a very complex question. And it's very difficult to argue in favor of the Iranian position because Iran has been demonized so much that anybody who speaks up for the Iranian version of things may be seen to be either an apologist for Iran or not understanding the true nature of the Iranian regime. There's one issue on which I feel that the West exaggerates a great deal, the threat from Iran, and that's on the nuclear question. The narrative is that Iran is going to use nuclear weapons against Israel. I can't see for a moment why Iran would be so utterly foolish to do that, because they know they'll be wiped out as a nation in no time. And they don't have, at the moment, the capability of doing so. And if tomorrow they actually succeed in building 1 or 2 bombs, in the face of 10,000 bombs that the United States has and 100 or 200 that Israel has, I just can't see the rationale. And number 2, Iran is not a kind of a carpetbagger nation which has just emerged in the last 40, 50 years as some other countries have emerged. It's an old civilization. It's an old civilization. And therefore, why should they destroy that heritage and that legacy and the civilization by doing something which is utterly foolish? And thirdly, the existence of Iran, the self-image of Iran, is not dependent on this kind of hostility towards Israel to the point of using nuclear weapons against it. It defies common sense. And I've told the Iranians that you are making a serious mistake in the way you target Israel and you deny the Holocaust, and you talk indirectly about wiping the state of Israel off the map, that you are doing yourself tremendous disservice, and that even those who understand where you come feel nonplussed as to why you carry it that far. Of course, they say, well, this is a side issue, the real issue is with the United States of America. And that once we are able to reach some kind of an agreement with the United States, this issue will fall by the wayside.
Are you then surprised by Mr. Halevy's views? Is it a refreshing change to see somebody, again, as the former head of the intelligence in Israel, to have these kind of views on dialogue with a country like Iran, on trying to understand the people of Iran?
Well, firstly, let me also say that we sometimes have a wrong impression of Israel, as if everybody in Israel wants to militarily act against Iran. I think there are a very sizable body of very responsible people within Israel who don't want that. And you don't see the logic of this. And therefore, I'm not surprised that a person of the stature of Mr. Halevy says that the road to a solution with Iran is through dialogue. But having said that, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't quite fit into the political mold of Mr. Halevy. Maybe he's competing with Avi Lieberman on his right, and he therefore doesn't want to yield political space to him, and therefore takes up these extremely radical positions. And this constant threat of using military weapons, using military means against Iran, I don't think is helping actually to promote what people like Mr. Halevy are doing to create the right conditions for a dialogue with Iran.
How does the establishment in Israel respond to these views when you talk about talking to Iran, when you say that, and you said that a military strike is not off the table, but it should be the absolute last resort? How does the establishment view you? I mean, are there other people who agree with what you say?
Well, first of all, let me say that alongside my advocacy of talking to the Iranians, which I have been advocating for many years now, for several years, I don't want to minimize the threat of Iran to Israel. Let us be honest about this. Iran and Israel are at war, not because Israel has decided to go to war, but because Iran has decided to go to war. Every day now we have rocket attacks from Gaza into Israeli territory in the south, and all the equipment and all the rockets have been actually manufactured either on Iranian territory Or, for instance, as recently became clear, on Sudanese territory, for example, where the Iranians had a big factory manufacturing this kind of equipment. So we have a state of war. We have a state of war in the north with Lebanon on our Lebanese border. We have a whole group there, the Hezbollah in the south, who are armed to the teeth by the Iranians. So I don't want to minimize the threat of Iran to Israel. And on top of that, we have the fact that Iran, which is a member state of the United Nations, denies the right of Israel as a member of the United Nations to exist. And this is something which is intolerable. I think it's intolerable internationally, and it's intolerable otherwise. And that's why the Prime Minister of Israel, Mr. Netanyahu, who, by the way, appointed me head of the Mossad, so maybe he was also aware of some of my views, and he thought that I might have been at that time the right man at the right spot. So as you don't wish us to demonize Iran, and you're right, I don't think we should demonize Mr. Netanyahu. He's the elected Prime Minister of Israel. And he has been elected in democratic elections, which in itself is a very, very rare phenomenon in the Middle East, unfortunately. So we have to realize that. And therefore, as I say again, we must not minimize the threat. We must be ready for every contingency, but we must do everything we can to talk to people. And we have to talk to people. And my experience in recent years has been around the world where I've been speaking at gatherings, where there have been Iranians, not only Iranians who are opposition Iranians, but also Iranians who come from the ranks of the hierarchy in Iran, that they are listening to me. They don't talk to me, they talk at me. We sit in rooms, they talk to the wall, and I talk to the wall. And the wall somehow resonates back, and I hear what they're saying, and they hear what I'm saying, you know? So we have a way of dialoguing. And I think that if we persevere, and I believe we will persevere, ultimately, there is no alternative to talking.
Do you think Israel is misunderstood, Mr. Halevy? Do you think that there are misconceptions about the Israeli establishment and about Mossad in particular? What would you say are the top 3 myths about Israel?
Well, you know, there are misconceptions about everybody and everything. I would almost say that there are also misconceptions about India, but I won't mention them today. And there are misconceptions about China, but I will not mention China either today. But yes, there are some misconceptions about Israel, and I think that there is a misconception about why Israel originally came into being and where Israel wishes to go. Israel came into being as the nation and the state of the Jewish people. We've been there for over 3,000 years. We speak the language of our forefathers. We read the Bible in Hebrew, which is our language, and we speak the language of the Bible today. We're probably one of the most ancient peoples on earth. And after 2,000 years in exile, we came back to our country. We realized there were others there as well. By the way, all the time, throughout the ages, there were always Jews in what was considered Palestine, Jewish communities, thriving communities. And we realized that ultimately we would have to find a modus vivendi. And when the United Nations came about in 1947, many years ago, around the same time that India became independent, and decided that there would be 2 states, we accepted the solution, the other side didn't accept it, and we ultimately had to go to war, and there was a war, and there were the results of the war, and we emerged with our state intact. We basically want to find a modus vivendi with our neighbors. It's a difficult task, a very difficult task, because there's culture involved, there's religion involved, and when you have religion involved, it's a very, very dangerous set of values which you have to put to the test. And therefore, I believe that we have to be patient, we have to persevere, and we will ultimately reach that point, and I believe that ultimately we will have the peace we are seeking with our neighbors.
Mr. Sibal, what do you think is the biggest mistake that Israel is making in how it handles its neighbors and its neighborhood?
A little echo, and I can't hear.
What do you think is the biggest mistake Israel is making in how it approaches its neighbors and handles its neighbors and its neighborhood?
Well, you know, I would fully sympathize with Israel's extremely vulnerable position in the sea of Arabs around them. It's a small country with no depth and with such numerous enemies who have not accepted or unwillingly accepted or reluctantly accepted the existence of the State of Israel. So therefore, I can see where Israel's mindset and psychology comes from. And then, of course, behind that is this history of the Second World War and Holocaust and everything else. Now, having said that, one has to then see what is Israel's role and responsibility and that of its supporters in the United States and the Western world in preventing an equitable solution from emerging in this area between the Israelis and the Palestinians. A lot of countries have been at it for decades, and till today, there is no solution. I think in one area where one can fault Israel, and perhaps many countries would feel that and may not say so openly, is the Israeli settlement policy. Because they've kept on extending their settlements more and more into the West Bank. And they have divided and parceled out West Bank with their security roads and other things in such a way that even if tomorrow a two-state solution is possible, there will not actually be another state on the other side, because it will be a congeries of little localities not linked with each other, and therefore Israel completely controlling that territory. And that's a problem. That's a problem because if Mr. Halevy is right, and he's right historically that Jews have been in this area since 3,000 years, but the Arabs have also been there for a couple of thousand years or more. Now, that is one. The other, of course, is that Israel, and I can again see why they have done that, is that they do not want any threat to emerge in their neighborhood which might threaten their existence, and therefore they have taken military action time and again to suppress any possibility of any threat to them. And this has therefore given the image to Israel of a militaristic country which wants to deal with the challenges to its security in a particular way. Now, let me just give you a small example where our two countries differ. Now, we have the same problem with terrorism as Israel has, and we fully understand what their compulsions are, and I'm sure they understand ours. But our methodology with dealing with terrorists is very different. There is eye for eye, tooth for tooth, use your air force, use your tanks, kill them, assassinations and everything else, and that compounds the problems.
Many Indians would say we should emulate that. Many Indians would say that.
We don't do that.
Yeah, we don't.
We don't do that. We don't use our heavy military weapons against populations and this and that. Now, that creates its own reaction. Now, it's for the Israelis to see whether this methodology has really succeeded or will succeed, or whether a different tack ought to have been taken or should be now taken. But I think too much water has flown under the bridge for Israel to reverse its steps, and too much bad blood has been created for any viable solution to emerge in the near future.
Is that Israel's problem, that it is, at its core, a militaristic state that looks for a military solution to its problems?
Well, first of all, I'd like to invite everybody in this hall to visit our country. You will find that it's probably the most vibrant and free country, 24/7, round the clock, anytime, day or night you want to go around, you will find no security, and you are welcome at any moment, at any time. That's number one. Secondly, I'd like to say this on our security. Security is not something that we have chosen because we have fallen in love with it. We have to be secure, so we have to secure ourselves. However, on 2 points I'd like to make a clarification, shall we say, concerning the opinions expressed by my learned colleague to the right. One is referring to the settlements in the West Bank. I believe that ultimately, if we have a solution between us and the Palestinians, then ultimately the problem of settlements will have to be dealt with in a way which will enable the Palestinians to have a viable state. And a viable state means to say that certainly some of the settlements, if not more of them, might not be there anymore. In order for this to happen, we have to have a dialogue. We have to talk to the Palestinians. We have to have a negotiation with the Palestinians. And we have to have a negotiation without preconditions. We have to talk as quick as we can. I agree with you that time is not on our side. That's why it's urgent. And that's why I would urge anybody here in the hall who has any influence with the Palestinians to urge them to come to the table as soon as possible. The quicker, the better. Don't wait for Friday to end. Do it today, this afternoon, this evening. Unfortunately, the Palestinians are divided. The West Bank is under one regime. The Gaza Strip is under another regime. It's very difficult to conduct a negotiation with a divided enemy, which one side represents one set of ideas, the other side another set of ideas. And I would like to say one thing more about the wars which we have had. Yes, we have had a long series of wars. All the wars except one were initiated by us. Were initiated by the other side, and that's not it's not a Freudian slip. All the wars were initiated by the other side, except for one. All the wars were designed to bring about, in one way or other, the demise of the State of Israel. All of them ultimately failed. There was one leader on the Arab side who had the courage and the determination and the capability to come to us and to sit with us at the table, and that was Anwar Sadat. He was the president of Egypt. He initiated a war against us in 1973, and he came to Jerusalem on his own volition, to the surprise of the Israeli Republic. By the way, between you and me, not to the surprise of the Mossad. Because the negotiation on his arrival took place on Moroccan soil under the auspices of the Mossad. And he came and he laid his request for peace on the table, and two things happened. Israel withdrew from every inch of Egyptian soil, every inch. That's one thing. And the other thing is, unfortunately, that Sadat was murdered. He was murdered by a group who unfortunately now are in power as a result of the events that happened in Egypt. But here is the silver lining, ladies and gentlemen, this morning. This group, the Muslim Brotherhood, who have been implacable enemies of the State of Israel, have repeatedly stated that they will not touch and will not do anything to change the peace treaty that Egypt has with Israel, that it's an international obligation, and this obligation will be respected. This is, I'd say, one of the rays of hope we have in the Middle East. There are others as well. There are many forces in the Middle East on the other side who are working in the same direction that I've indicated this morning. They need to be encouraged, and they need to be told, carry on.
Are you too optimistic? I'm asking that because the Arab Spring, as it's called, hasn't it in many ways complicated things for Israel? Maybe the peace treaty is safe now, but in the long term?
I believe the peace treaty will be safe as long as Egypt needs to deal with its problems, and this is going to be for a very long time to come. You've discussed many issues here this morning, water and other issues. In the next few years, in the next decade, we're going to have 1 billion more population on this earth. There's not enough water for this additional billion. There's not enough food for it. The Egyptian population has doubled in the last 30, 40 years. You have to find food and water and employment and a quality of life for a country which is besaddled by unemployment which is tremendous. The same, by the way, applies to Iran. The population of Iran has doubled in the last 30, 40 years. There are almost between 80 and 90 million population in Iran today, as compared to 40 to 50 million just a short time ago. These domestic problems are going to be the critical problems for every administration. And if the powers that be in Tehran, the powers that be in Egypt, in Cairo, will not find the solutions to this, they will be held accountable by the public. And I believe that in this there is, as I say, a ray of hope. Because ultimately, every regime, every country, every leadership, including the leadership of India, including the leadership of Israel, first and foremost have to tend to the well-being of the public, the well-being of every person here in the hall. And I believe that this is the acid test. It'll be the acid test here, it'll be the acid test in Egypt, in Iran, in Israel, and everywhere else in the world.
Would you agree with that, or do you see the glass a little more empty?
No, I think the broad objective that Mr. Halevy has outlined would have everybody's support. But I have a slight problem, which is that Mr. Netanyahu continues to talk about
a strike.
Military strike against Iran. And at least from what one reads and what one talks to people who are involved, the US administration is trying to hold him back because they don't want Israel to do anything precipitate, which might then involve them and create enormous problems for them. From our point of view, any military action, for whatever reason, would be most undesirable because we have 6 million people in the Gulf. We have $38 billion of remittances coming from there. 80% of our oil supplies come from that region. And if this region bursts into flames because of Israeli action or US military action, we'll have an enormous problem on our hands. I mean, from Libya, we moved out 18,000 people, within a month with great difficulty. We can't move out 6 million people out of the Gulf. And with all the other collateral damage that will be done to the Indian economy, including the shooting up of oil prices. I think that's a very wrong way to deal with this problem, however intractable it is, and it will leave behind a legacy of even more conflict and more hostility amongst the Arabs and the Iranians, between the Shias and the Sunnis, and of course between Iran and the West, etc., etc. So I hope this thing doesn't happen. As for the Arab Spring, I was ambassador to Egypt, as was mentioned earlier, and while I think Sadat did show a great deal of statesmanship and became the linchpin of a certain degree of stability in the region because of the peace treaty with Israel, but it was a cold peace. There was no warmth in it, and he tried in every way to keep the relationship at the lowest level possible of engagement. And then, of course, while it is true that Israel vacated all the Sinai and everything else, but there were certain conditions laid down regarding the remilitarization of Sinai and all, which were perhaps all very sensible in order to prevent the possibility of renewed hostilities and conflict. From our point of view, we can't be very comfortable, even if Mr. Halevy sees some sort of a silver lining in the views of the Muslim Brotherhood and some other regimes that may come into power, taking a more practical view of the relationship with Israel, which makes sense because Egypt is so aid-dependent. It needs those $2 billion that it gets
American aid,
from the United States.
That would go, yes.
Now, of course, Qatar and Saudi Arabia have stepped in. I hope that doesn't give him more oxygen in terms of his Islamic leanings, which would be a pity. But I think that the Muslim Brotherhood is not wedded to any form of democracy. They come from a very different background. Yeah. And this kind of euphoria that is being built up by calling it the Arab Spring, as if flowers are going to bloom and butterflies are going to fly, to my mind, it is not realistic. You should see what it is and not get into this false discourse of democracy because it suits the Americans to say that is the Arab Spring, and because they're supporting the new regimes, they have to project them as being democratic. But I think behind this, there is a huge problem for countries like India, for countries like Israel, because from Tunis to the borders of Afghanistan, you will have the Muslim Brotherhood kind of ideology, which is going to become the dominant, successful ideology, and I think we should carefully think about the implications for us.
And you of all people understand the difficulties of working with the Muslim Brotherhood, their ideology, their links. You still see that silver lining. You still think that that they will look at the interests of people. They will be answerable to their people.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I broadly agree with the former ambassador to Egypt about the situation in Egypt today. But unfortunately, for him and for myself, we are not able to change the regime in Egypt today, in the foreseeable future. And therefore, the question is, do we deal with the people that are on the spot or not? And I think we have to deal with them as long as we can. Secondly, I'd like to say this. I have great respect for the policies of India on terrorism and other issues, and this was mentioned earlier on. I've had dealings with counterparts here in this country, and they're very eminent and very capable people. So I want you to feel safe, certainly here this morning. But I also want to say this. In the last 50 years, Mr. Ambassador, when India thought that its basic interests were at stake, India was also engaged in confrontation here with what you considered then as a foe. And the subcontinent in India has not always been as peaceful as it is today. And therefore, it's not that I take a leaf out of your book. Don't misunderstand me. But what I'm saying is that if our basic interests are at stake, and if they are endangered, we will have to take the necessary steps in order to protect them. Now, just one other thing I'd like to again say. I don't have the attack plans of Israel concerning Iran. I forgot to take them with me before I came.
But there goes my next question.
Maybe if you invite me next year, we'll discuss
Bring the
that.
maps.
Yeah. But I would like to say this, the idea of what's going to happen in the Gulf and so forth, if I were in your place, I would be relatively confident that some of these prophecies that you mentioned and probably are very dangerous to India will probably not come true. The Iranians were the first to rush to say that they're not going to close the Straits of Hormuz, that they will not do so. And that's after a spate of very, very vitriolic statements which they issued a few days before they made the statement which more or less calmed the atmosphere. The Iranians are logical people. It's obviously often been asked, are they logical people? Yes, they're logical people. Their logic is not the same as ours, thank God. But they are logical people. And their self-preservation is the number one necessity which they have, like every other nation in the world. And therefore, my view is that we should approach this as we've always approached these problems, with a sword and an olive branch. You have the sword on one hand and the olive branch on the other hand, just as, by the way, India has. And I believe that the way you have done this in the last 50, 60 years has been very, very profitable and very conducive to the interests of India.
But do you believe?
And it will also be the interests of Israel.
But do you, many people believe that any immediate threat of military action by Israel against Iran has been averted for now, perhaps for the next 8 or 9 months. Do you think it's going to happen?
Well, you said 8 to 9 months as you're saying this.
That's
that's your
what many
understanding.
analysts believe.
Okay, I don't have any time frame like that. I believe that after the 6th of November, when there's going to be an election in a country not quite far away from us, and I believe after the 6th of November, probably there's going to be a very, very serious effort on the part of many people around the world to get the Iranians to the table to discuss very seriously this issue. And I'm sure that in these discussions, the Iranians will also have to come to terms with realities. If they really come to terms with the realities, then I think there is a hope for avoiding more undesirable results or unintended consequences, as we used to call them. It's a very nice expression to use, unintended consequences. Please remember that phrase. As we go along.
One last comment from Mr. Sibal.
Very, very quickly.
Just give us a minute.
Very, very quickly. One that, at least in my conversations with the Americans, not the American administration, they're not going to share their war plans with me either. But people who are pretty well plugged into the US administration say that we have 1 year to 18 months before a military strike takes place, because this is the time frame they give for Iran to actually acquire nuclear weapon capability. So that threat is very much there. Secondly, and this is important, that Iran has offered, through the back channel and otherwise,
to talk, yes,
that they are willing to go to the United Nations, to the Security Council, and have a resolution passed in which they will give up their right to build military, civilian, nuclear military capability. In other words, it will be a resolution in the United Nations backed by the P5. But in order to get to that point, there has to be some action on the Western side to begin to lift sanctions. But unfortunately, the American political establishment is simply unable to even look at the possibility of lifting sanctions because politically it will be hugely problematic, not only for Obama, but also for Romney if he wins.
Okay.
So there has to be some give and take, and we are not seeing the contours of that give and take.
Well, gentlemen, I have to leave it at that. It's been fascinating to talk to both of you. But Mr. Halevy, one quick last question, which was on popular demand from sections of the audience. Is it true that a Mossad agent can kill someone with a straw and a newspaper?
Is it what?
Is it true that a Mossad agent can kill the enemy with a straw or a newspaper?
I don't know how to do it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really nice talking to you. Thank you.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners,
we shall overcome.
Wow.